الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحابته ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. الحمد لله على نعمة الإسلام وكفى بها نعمة. الحمد لله على نعمة الإسلام وكفى بها نعمة. الحمد لله على نعمة الإسلام وكفى بها نعمة. اللهم إني أعوذ بك أن أضل وضل أو أزل أو زل أو أظلم أو أظلم أو أجهل أو يجهل علي. I seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I should go astray or be led astray, or that I should be oppressed, or that I oppress, or that I should be ignorant, or that I'm ignorant, or ignorance is done to me, or that I should trip, or that I should be tripped. Inshallah, the title of this talk was Secularism, the greatest danger facing Islam. And what I'd like to do is, inshallah, look at the idea of secularism historically and the results of the secular idea upon the psyche of humankind, what the implications of that mean for us as Muslims particularly, but also the implications of it globally for humankind, because we are Bani Adam, we're all part of the offspring of Adam alayhi salam, and so we share common destinies in this world, and inshallah we will not share common destinies in the next world with those who reject the Adamic way, the Ibrahimic way, and the Muhammadan way, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa salatu wa salamu ala al-anbiya'i ajma'in. The idea of secularism is really a rather modern idea. In fact, it means in Latin, one of the meanings of it is modern, or of the age, or of the time, and it has the idea of temporality, or an in-time situation. The word in Latin, seclorum, you'll find on the dollar bill, which in the back of it there's a Freemasonic seal, and most of the founding fathers, and this is historical, it's not conspiratorial theories, or it's accepted history in the United States, that most of the founding fathers were Freemasons, but the actual seal did not come until 1935 when it was placed on the dollar bill during the Roosevelt administration. And on the back of the dollar bill it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means a new secular order, and really what the word secular is a nice way of saying worldly, or of the world, quite literally, a new order of the world. And this was to be in contradistinction with the old way, which is orders that were based on religious structures. In other words, understandings that peoples had that were based on religious hierarchical structures, on the belief that not only were we created, but there was a creator, and that there was a certain standard of behavior that was demanded of individuals that made up a society based on certain religion and moral injunctions that came down to them. So the Christian tradition, despite the gross breaches of Christianity, nonetheless had a moral order that is not really that different from the moral order of the Muslims. And this is why we share with other religions certain basic moral concepts and precepts. Where we begin to depart grossly is how we deal with breaches of the moral order. And this is what we call in Islam the hudud in Sharia. In other words, when there are gross breaches of the moral order, how do Muslims deal with that? We deal with it by going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, and looking at what the Sharia dictates for us, this sacred law, this sacred way. The Christians traditionally, because they separated their teaching from the Judaic tradition, which did have a sacred law, and this can be found in remnants of it in Deuteronomies and Numbers and Leviticus and the books of the Old Testament, where there are injunctions of how to deal with thieves, of how to deal with fornicators, adulterers, all of these things. The Christians departed from this based on a a verse that's in the New Testament from Paul in Romans 7, where he uses an analogy of a woman married to a man, and she's bounded by the law as long as she's married to the man, and when the husband dies, she's no longer bound by the law, in other words, of being a married woman. She can go and marry other men. Well, in what Paul uses this as an analogy for the death of Jesus Christ. In other words, that when Jesus was alive, we were still bound to the law, meaning the Judaic law. But since Jesus has died, we are no longer bound to the law. Jesus has freed us through his death from the law. And this is a very important concept in Christianity. And this is really setting up the scenario of the using the rational intellect to deal with law. In other words, Paul's belief, and whether he was sincere in it or not, Allahu Alam, but Paul's belief within his based on what he said, is that people, because they were in such a deeply spiritual state, imbued with the Spirit of Christ, they would not go into the errors that necessitated the law in the first place. So it was almost like, if we're looking at it as Paul being a sincere person in what he was preaching, that his spiritual state was so high, based on being imbued with the Holy Spirit and with the Spirit, that he could not fornicate, that he would not, because he was in such a deeply exalted spiritual state. This is the idea. Now, this is an extremely idealistic, romantic picture of the human being. The idea that through accepting Jesus Christ, one becomes angelic. One has now entered into the realm of spirit, and the flesh is no longer a difficulty for him. Now, we have seen historically the results of this kind of idea. But what it did in separating from the sacred law, it created the viability within a Christian society for secular law. For secular law. In other words, for worldly laws to be brought about by the emperor or by legislation, like now that's used in Parliament or in the United States in Congress, the legislation of laws. So the secular idea is literally that religion has fettered the human being from progression. In other words, what happened in Christianity, because the Christian world was so deeply suspicious of science, and in fact, because they tied their metaphysics to Aristotelian metaphysics. In other words, the transubstantiation of the wine and the bread into the blood and the flesh. The Catholics don't like to talk about this, but they believed, based on Aristotelian physics, that this was possible. They based the idea that the blood and the flesh were literally blood and flesh. It was not a metaphor. And this was a doctrine within the Catholic Church that they're ashamed of now. When Aristotelian thought began to become challenged, and this happened, oddly enough, from the introduction of Muslim arguments against Aristotelian thought. Tahafut al-Falasifa was one of the books that was translated into Latin, where Imam al-Ghazali refutes much of what the Aristotelians believed in terms of metaphysics, and he in fact categorically denied the ability for the human intellect to arrive at a sound metaphysic. In other words, what is beyond the physical world. That within certain limitations the human beings could discover things about the natural world. But about the spiritual or other world, it would only in the end be conjecture. Which is what Allah said, that they only follow conjecture, ultimately. And from a Muslim perspective, really this does not simply apply to metaphysics, but to the physical world as well. People don't like to admit this, but the vast majority of sciences in the Western civilization are actually based on conjecture. They are theories. Now, they watered them down to the masses as fact. We learn them in schools as facts. But those people that actually write the textbooks, or those discoverers and scientists that actually have come up with the theories, they're the ones that know the limitations of their own thought. People learn, for instance, in chemistry, the chemical table of elements. And this is a model that human beings have just projected onto the world. It is not reality. It is a model. Now, the model it's useful